Hey, good morning. Hello.
Hello, wonderful people.
January 2025. The year went by
Year's already over.
fast.
Don't wish to wait.
It's wonderful.
So much going on. I know the holidays just happened and we all had time off. It doesn't feel like that. It never stopped.
Agree.
Well, we've got a great episode here with my voice doing some things. It's just the age. I'm growing. My voice is changing, so
It'll get better.
right. Welcome to the January 2025 Guardians of M365 Governance episode. And very quickly, introductions. Joy?
Yes. My name is Joy Apple, Microsoft MVP and Director of Success for Orchestry. Been doing this Microsoft thing for over 16 years now. And I'm really excited for today's topic. It kind of lends well with the hot topics at Microsoft and the theme of this series. So I can't wait.
Ragnar.
And I'm still Ragnar Heil, MVP now since 7 years, working in Germany for Hans Vision, Bechtle, Business Development Manager for Microsoft.
And if I can maintain the voice, Christian Buckley. I'm a Microsoft MVP and Microsoft Regional Director, founder of Collab Talk, and also a consultant with Smarter Consulting. And excited to talk more about governance. Always excited to talk about governance, and there's always plenty to talk about. This is the hot topic. Last year, going to conferences, the last major conference I did was ESPC in Stockholm in last month. There was probably a third of the vendors in the expo hall talking about some aspect of governance. So it is very much a hot topic, especially as organizations are planning for rolling out Copilot and realizing that they need to get their data cleaned up, that it's time that they listen to the advice that the experts have been saying for the last 20 years, the last 10 years, the SharePoint world, 20 years in the SharePoint world.
Yeah, it's time.
It's time. It feels like time.
So last year we talked a lot about Copilot and governance, and now 2025 is going to be the year of agent governance.
That's right. It's interesting to look at a lot of what's being talked about and discussed in creating kind of self-governing agents that will go out and do things. You create that once, they take actions, they get triggered a lot.
Exactly.
I can relate to that.
That's exactly what I mean, why it's so important now, because in the past we had to make sure that we don't share outdated documents, otherwise the Copilot would hallucinate, or if we don't care about the versions, then we see content which we shouldn't see, but now they're getting autonomous. So we have to care more about the guardrails because they have more power, they can do more actions, they can be triggered, they have more knowledge sources. So as we all agree, governance is going to be more important than ever.
Absolutely. And I'm excited for today's guest because the gentleman we have brought along is not just an industry expert around governance, been in the SharePoint space for a long time. He actually happens to be my CEO. So we've got Michal Pisarek all the way from Vancouver, British Columbia today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's not raining here, which if you've ever been to Seattle or Vancouver during the winter months is pretty extraordinary. The weather's been amazing. It's been like 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. Ragnar understands joy.
I'm working
No
on
idea.
it.
Is that balmy? Is that like summer like?
Like
40-ish, I think. Yeah. But there's no rain. There hasn't been rain for a while.
Some weather like we have at the moment.
Wait until 2025 hits you, though.
Yeah, we haven't gone any this year. I'm Australian originally, but I've been here for about 16 years. But the first year that I was here, it snowed a lot here in Vancouver. And I thought being Canada, they would be adept at dealing with snow, but it was carnage here. Car flipped over, people falling over. And I realized that you actually don't get that much.
Seattle doesn't know that. People don't realize how hilly Seattle is till they come out. And that when it snows and when there's ice, there are videos.
Oh, yeah.
Buses and cars sliding down hills in Seattle that are very entertaining, but quite destructive.
Yeah, we get the same thing here. And essentially the rest of Canada laughs at Vancouver, as they should, because they're very adept at dealing with the feet of snow they get every year.
Well, Michal, I know I've known you for many, many years, and I knew you back when you were consulting and your first product company, and you've had some sales of a couple of companies. But what brought you into the governance space?
I got into Microsoft and SharePoint when I first came to Canada in 2008. Before then, I was doing computer science and traditional engineering and development, and then moved more into a business analyst space. Got to Canada after backpacking around the world for a year, which was amazing, and really needed a job. I looked up the two most well-paying industries at that time, and it was either SAP or this relatively new thing called Microsoft or SharePoint. I was like, okay, I gotta blag myself a job in one of these things. Around SAP, everything is very closely guarded. There's no community. It's very difficult to find out even what SAP was. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to learn this Microsoft SharePoint thing. Got an interview as a SharePoint expert where I had no experience in SharePoint at all, but I kind of spent a couple of weeks studying it and passed and got a job, and it started from there. In terms of the governance space, previous product was an intranet product. There was a lot of governance around that. On the intranet side, ensuring content ownership and publishing, that was always a challenge for organizations, making sure that the correct copy of the HR policy was the one available to all users, not one that was updated 3 years ago. But as we've all seen over the years, with the freeform nature of people being able to create teams and SharePoint sites and documents and content, governance has always been a challenge. It's been something bubbling under the surface for a number of years. Organizations knew that from a governance perspective, it was always a mess. Permissions are obviously difficult to deal with SharePoint and Teams. So people knew they had broken permissions. People knew that they had a bunch of content and a bunch of stuff that either hasn't been used or it's been out of date. I think it's really over the last probably 12 to 18 months that the governance conversation has shifted from governance, which was quite difficult to sell to organizations. And you have to do a governance project. No one cares. Really difficult to get funding. Now, because of Copilot and Copilot Readiness, that governance piece in terms of content, users, and security in particular is something that needs to be foundational. Otherwise, you just don't get the best value out of Copilot. So it's always been something that I've been interested in. I think over the last year or so with Copilot, it's something now that CEOs, CIOs, and security officers are now also interested in. And I think now you're seeing that huge uptick of organizations trying to get their governance in place, whether it's around more of the traditional content side or the user side. But the big thing that we're seeing also is around that security and permission side. And I think that's going to keep going, especially with Copilot agents being introduced now. Now that anyone can go in, create a Copilot agent within a SharePoint site, it's really that underlying content that they're using that has to be correct. So there's going to be a huge groundswell of governance related initiatives for organizations, whether they're starting now or the next couple of years.
It's a really brilliant move for this, like as you brought up, this personal Copilot version. For me to be able to go in without having to go through this massive effort to clean up all of the data in my organization, to be very careful so that, well, for this agent, I only want it to pull from this subset of a subset of data around this. Instead, I can go and build this walled off, dedicated agent, build a Copilot for my SharePoint environment that has only the data trained on that to do this specific thing. That is a brilliant move to make that as easy as possible for people to go in and do. And we could talk about the licensing required for individuals to go in and do that. But for Microsoft to go and do that, that's a great way to then open up a larger organization that's nervous about opening it up wide to Copilot to start to see it. It's kind of like the social collaboration tools that grew rapidly that way, where finally somebody wakes up on the executive team to say, hey, there's value here broadly for everybody. It's already inside the organization in several different areas.
Yeah.
But I think that's what we're going to start to see with Copilot.
And it makes it more accessible to the people sitting at the desk, the data creators, the data owners, the SharePoint site owners, teams owners. From a governance perspective, though, I do think it's interesting. Sometimes as human beings, we think, oh, we'll go do this thing and it'll just work. But if you think about it, let's say HR, Michael, you mentioned HR earlier. How often have we seen customers in the wild, they have all of the right content in exactly the right place? typically there's some sprawl, right? And some work has to be done to put it where it needs to be and put the right permissions around it. So once again, we're going back to those customer decision makers saying, you need to do some governance. What's your audience? What's the permissions? What's the security? So again, you're getting that return on the investment. It's a continuous cycle. Like you said, Christian, it's been around for 20 something years. Review your content, put it where it's supposed to be, give the right people the right level of access. And the technology will really shine.
Yeah, I think Copilot readiness for us is Microsoft 365 Governance made sexy. It's still the same activities going towards the same goal, but now you have this big driver, right, around Copilot, around AI. And I think a lot of organizations, Microsoft has done a really, really good job of this kind of FOMO of a lot of organizations, the kind of fear of missing out that they have to get ready now. Over the last 6 months or a year, Microsoft has understood how difficult it is to get ready and started to put products. So SharePoint Premium, for instance, and some of the other features. But it's a big lift for a lot of organizations. I mean, there's a lot of work typically that has to be done. But I do like the Copilot agent approach because I think the big thing that it does allow organizations, it almost allows people to kind of understand what Copilot is doing because you're scoping it down to this very smaller particular subset of content. Whereas Copilot in general, you might ask it a question and it might get responses from anywhere that you have content. And I think that can be really confusing. So I think even from a trust perspective, I think that's a really good route to go down where at least people know, hang on, where's this getting these answers from? Well, this agent is getting this answer from these particular 20 documents or this particular library. So I think that's a really, really smart move from Microsoft to introduce those kind of SharePoint-based agents in, and then all of the other ones that they're putting in as well throughout the platform.
It's almost like Microsoft has learned from previous experiences. You know, when you think of going back to the SharePoint, the intranet world, people would build custom solutions for SharePoint for their smaller organization, their business unit. And then somebody in the organization would see and be like, hey, we want this. It's like, yeah, well, it really wasn't architected. It wasn't designed to scale on things around that. Power Platform had some similar issues where governance around Power Platform became very important because organizations were realizing who's building what, where are they building it? Is it accessing the right content? Is it the right architecture to scale? Like, we really like what you've done over in HR, but can the entire organization, can it work in a multi-tenant? What does all that look like? It seems like day one, Microsoft was thinking about that with Copilot, but certainly with the agents, now you even have the ability for third parties to go and develop agents and make it available out in marketplaces, but you can build these things internally. If you have parts of the organization that are not licensed, those licenses can be on a consumption model, only pay for what you're using from those solutions. Go and purchase agent solutions from a marketplace or from a central internal marketplace of the different pieces and pay for what you use. It's a smarter way to architect the solution so that you're not repeating the mistakes of having these non-scalable solutions floating around your organization, breaking things.
I think that's a very important topic because the licensing is crazy complicated. If you look into the Power Platform, the licensing guide is like 55 pages. Nobody knows it by heart. I always use Copilot to understand the licensing guide. Let's say if we have the conversation in 2024, we talk about how to get the maximum out of the 20 or the $US per user per month for Copilot M365. But now we're going deeper into the pay-as-you-go models. And the agents are going to be metered, and there will be pay-as-you-go. The same for Copilot Studio. There will be pay-as-you-go payments. So therefore, one of the biggest drivers for governance for me is to control the licensing costs. Because when the active usage and the adoption increases massively, there will be costs, but the costs are not fixed prices, like license costs. It's going to be pay as you go. So that's one of the top predictions for 2025. The license topic is going to be more relevant for governance because of this pay as you go models.
Yeah, I think it's a super smart business move right now because if you go down that metered license model, someone creates one of these agents and accidentally exposes it to the entire organization, and then everyone starts using that for one day. I mean, that can get really expensive. The same thing happened with the Power Platform. Right? I wonder if, I'm sure there's some smart people at Microsoft saying, well, $30 a month is good, but how can we get even more money out of here? What if we do a metered model for the kind of pay as you go? I think today, probably 15 minutes ago, they just announced that Copilot chat is now free for commercial
Saw that
customers.
this morning.
So that's a very different kind of approach that Microsoft was going previously. But I agree with you, Ragnar. I think the licensing in Microsoft 365, let alone the Power Platform, has always been a horrific nightmare to try to understand what's going on, which licenses and so forth. But I wonder, like you said, what controls are going to be available from that metered licensing side to make sure that someone doesn't accidentally create an agent, stick it on the front page of their intranet, and then all of a sudden you get a bill for $100,000 within a couple of days because people are just going in there and asking it questions all the time.
Again, it's an argument for being proactive, having that governance, reviewing, understand what people are billing, just having that like a center of excellence approach to what are people doing? Why are they doing that? Just to keep tabs on what's happening in the organization, not to stop people, but to be aware of what's happening and what those costs are. You still need a doctorate to understand Microsoft licensing. That's always been true for whatever product area. If you see that suddenly, hey, this consumption model, we're spending X dollars, suddenly signing a long-term Copilot, enterprise agreement for that capability can be a lot more cost effective. I thought we'd start seeing it this fall. I think there still needs to be some improvements where in the types of the stories that are being told around Copilot, where it's much more around the ROI. So people move past saying like, oh, $30 a user a month is really expensive. Yeah, but if you look at, I saw right away, I went and signed up, paid for my personal instance. I went and purchased a license for that. So with tax, like $400 a year for just me, because even the basic capability of Copilot provided far more value than $30 a month subscription. And so I think it's easy to go and tell that story, but obviously for people that have companies that have thousands of employees, that's a huge cost.
Yeah.
However, value returned.
And now my idea is, Christian, we should maybe talk to a governance tool company who's very strong in provisioning. Let's take Orchestry for example.
Just randomly, let's see
because in the past we talked about the provisioning for SharePoint, for Teams, maybe also for Viva Engage communities, but now we can also talk about the provisioning for agents. Who should have access to an agent and who not? Because otherwise, if this is now free, maybe there is definitely an overuse. For example, in Germany, with companies with hundreds of thousands of employees, and maybe they should not all use the favored photo creation agent, because otherwise it would run completely out of control with the cost.
Yeah. And being able to see like what are the ones that are most active, especially when you have agents around that, you can start to look at what are the most common pathways. What are people actually using? So it's not just about the usage from an adoption standpoint of looking at what end users are doing, but it's like looking at what actually tools, what workflows, what agents are being leveraged so that you can, data-driven decisions around what are we going to go spend our time in? What do we need to do more of? What's still missing from those solutions? That's a great automation story, being able to watch and understand what's moving through your system.
I just get deja vu with the introduction of the M365 marketplace. The customer said everything is going to be open. Every user can go into the marketplace and activate their add-ons. And others say, listen, we're closing down the whole marketplace. No end user should ever go and install an add-on for Outlook or for Teams. It's like black and white, agents yes or no, but I want to go into the gray zone. And if you enter this 50 shades of gray of agents, then you need governance and provisioning.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there's anything, well, there probably is actually stuff available at the moment to do that. It's something that we're looking into, Ragnar. The other thing is reporting around agents as well, especially the SharePoint agents. It's just a file. It's a JSON file with a .agent extension. It's actually very simple. We're doing some reporting in terms of how many agents you have, what's been created, and who has access to these things. I'm sure Microsoft is going to open up some more APIs in terms of usage, and how many agents you have. And we're going to be able to see that. And I think it's, I don't know if there's anything, well, there probably is actually stuff available at the moment to do that. It's something that we're looking into, Ragnar. The other thing is reporting around agents, especially the SharePoint agents. It's actually very simple. We doing some reporting in terms of how many agents you have, what's been created, and who has access to these things. I'm sure Microsoft is going to open up some more APIs in terms of and
Mhm.
how it's been metered. I agree. It's kind of the typical Microsoft thing. They launch it, it's very open until people complain and they're like, this is crazy. Now I have all these agents everywhere. No one knows what's going on. And then they slowly start to bring that back. And it's the same thing with the Power Platform and some of these other architectures.
Well, SharePoint too was that unofficial. Remember, when it was the server-based solution. A lot of what SharePoint was is it started by somebody in IT that installed it on a box underneath their desk, and then an executive saw it, so it had that viral component. Give it to them in a way that people are going to go and just start using it, and it expands. And then in some ways, it's almost too late. It's everywhere in the organization. We got to figure out a way to
Right.
centralize it. Yep.
So that becomes a very interesting conversation. In the past part of my career was full-time trainer. That was at a time when companies were investing more and more. Like I'm talking like 08, 9, 10. People were really investing in training. And we saw a shift away from that. But if something is put out there that's a little bit more approachable, more natural language than search queries, you can have a conversation with your technology to find what you need instead of a list of files. You have to decide which one you're going to click on. Then you have to figure out if that's even the right file. Now, it's more approachable from the user perspective. If there's truly a return on that investment, there's value there. Decisions are being made faster, content's being created faster, it's accurate. Why would you want to take that away? Is that going to be expensive? Probably. But if we can look at our holistic licensing model and go, gosh darn it, we've got people licensed for E3 and E5. Let's scale that back and leave the Copilot licensing in place, right? That becomes an easier conversation. Having governance not just around what should be where and permission, but licensing models can really set organizations up for great success in this without killing them at the licensing cost.
And Michael, what are when you talk to customers, what are the three primary scenarios, the pain points of customers that you're talking to from a governance standpoint?
Maybe let's talk about it as it relates to getting ready for Copilot, because that's probably a little bit more specific. So the first one is, the fundamental issue organizations have is if you've got a bunch of crap content, then Copilot's just going to give you back a bunch of crap, especially from a generative AI perspective. Like there's no magic brain quite yet that can troll through and really understand, that content. So for most of our organizations, the biggest issues that we have is we've got a ton of content. We don't know where it is. We don't know what it is. And we're pretty sure that like 90% of it is probably stuff that we shouldn't have, but we don't have enough time to go through or get users to go through and manually clean that stuff up. So one of them is this idea of how do we at least get rid of the content or archive or remove the content that we know is not going to be relevant for Copilot. So, projects from 20 years ago, for instance, right? Or maybe 37 versions of the HR policy, which was worked on in some random sort of site. So it's definitely one around content freshness. That's probably the first thing. The second thing is really around security. Now, you folks know working in SharePoint, it's very easy to get into a nightmare scenario of security in terms of sharing links, broken permissions, how you give access to people. Do you give them access at the group level or at the SharePoint site level? And do you do that directly, or do you do that through SharePoint permissions? And are they assigned SharePoint permissions directly, or are they assigned SharePoint permissions through an Azure AD group? And who's in that group? There's no real easy way out of the box to understand fully what those permissions look like. For a lot of organizations, it's kind of this kind of permission cleanup story, right? What do we have and who has access to what? And that typically manifests itself, and I'm sure everyone's been through this, and we hear this time and time again for organizations. We rolled out Copilot, it was going great, then someone created something and it got some random document which they didn't even know they had access to, and used that for Gen AI. They got the wrong result, and people are like, to hell with this. We're not going to use this anymore because Copilot doesn't know what it's doing. Or more nefarious means where someone goes in and says, what's the CEO's salary, for instance? Or am I going to get promoted? And again, it's smart enough to work out that it's not looking for the keyword CEO's salary. It understands those relationships through the graph and finds that document. So I think the permissions thing is probably the second biggest part. And the third part is really around how are my users using this and am I getting value out of it? So more around that user adoption piece.
Mhm.
The organizations know there's value there, but when they're paying $30 a month, they have to have some sort of additional ROI. You've seen Microsoft really push in that direction with Ignite a couple of months ago. You've noticed those Copilot reports are much more from an ROI piece, right? So how much? Because again, that's what they're hearing for their customers. So I think those are the main three. For me, the security piece, though, at the moment is probably one that organizations are finding the most challenging because it's very difficult to understand from a permissions perspective who has access to what and how did they get access and how does this work. Even from a content perspective, most of the organizations that we work with at Orchestry are starting to pay Microsoft for additional storage, which gets really expensive really quick. So that's one of their challenges. We know we have all of this content. We do hundreds of projects. Once a project is done, people are on to the next one. No one's going back, archiving stuff, changing permissions, removing guests and removing shared links. For a lot of organizations, there's a big lift to clean up a lot of the content they have. Copilot makes it really easy to find stuff that you might not know you have access to. It's far easier than search because it doesn't have to be keyword based. You can put in a bunch of stuff and it does a really convincing job when it generates something, right? Because you're like, this is great. But again, we've heard a lot of stories where, we'll talk about the HR example, for instance, a HR person from the UK goes in and tries to create a new policy based on information that they have, looks really good. They send it out. Well, one of the 3 documents referenced wasn't from the UK, it was from Singapore because they had a shared link that was shared out to them 2 years ago, right? For them. But they didn't know. So there's some of the challenges that we're hearing. So content, security, and also the last thing is around that user adoption piece.
That's one of the reasons why I love the Orchestry story and it being so strong on the provisioning side of it. By having that life cycle management of that site, of the content, of all the assets already in place. It's part of it so that the user doesn't have to think about it when the project reaches that stage. Here's what we've automated on the back end to handle that data, to automatically archive after 90 days of inactivity, whatever it is. Automating all of that is the answer.
Well, what's coming up fairly soon is a big push into the security story because we believe for customers getting ready for Copilot, you need those content owners to be able to make decisions around the content that they have quickly and easily. Like it can't be IT just going through these sites and saying, don't need that, don't need that, don't need that, because people are like, what the hell are you doing? So one of the new features we've got coming up where, we have a good story around the provisioning side and the archival side, but really where the madness happens is in the middle, right? Where people are working on content, creating shared links, adding users, adding guests. We have this thing we're bringing out shortly, the idea of a workspace review. Now you can send it off every month and a user or an owner can go through and say, yep, the permissions are still correct. These people still should have access. And hey, here's all of the shared links. We shouldn't have these in here, or even these are the broken permissions. Let's remove them. So this idea now that we can empower our owners, because that's the only way we've seen organizations manage to be at scale. Like it's one thing, people in IT, but if you got 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 teams or SharePoint sites, someone in IT isn't going to just go through and start making decisions around this content.
Nor should they.
Nor should they. There has to be a way that we can get those content owners involved within that process. And I totally agree with you, Christian. It has to be really simple and really easy. At the moment, it's really difficult for an owner to understand what was going on in my team, like what's being shared, being added, right? Again, we're trying to make that really simple. That can be great from a cleanup perspective, but also great going forward. We're going to give you this team of the SharePoint side, but every month or every quarter, you have to make sure that the sensitivity label is still correct, that the correct people still have access. That may be from a versioning perspective. We want to make sure your versions are still correct. You're not having the default 500 because we're ripping through storage. The big one is really going to be around that security piece where we can say over the last month, we've noticed Joy Apple, because she's always been a problem, let's be honest, keeps adding these people to these groups or keeps breaking permissions. As a user or as an owner during the review process, you can say remove. You can even remove Joy out of the group if you want to at that stage.
Solve all the problems. It's its core.
Exactly. But this idea where, we review governance as it has to be this kind of process that involves the business and involves the content owners. Maybe in 5 years, there'll be an intelligent enough AI agent to be able to do it all. But until then, it has to be a way.
That would be my question now, Michael, because I'm a believer that this whole X review stories is super important because it sells well, because then you can sell governance tool to IT and say, please, this is going to reduce your workload because you're empowering the owners of SharePoint and Teams and Leave Engage groups because they have to do the work. So less work for IT, which always resonates well. But then Christian also talks about the automation part. And here we can also think how we can use the semi-autonomous agent and how the agents can also help with these access reviews. So make a combination of Copilot, agents, automations, and the cleanup and access reviews.
Yeah, we're doing some internal experiments here with Sarah, our CTO, who's a genius. Big shout out to Sarah. Around Ragnar, for instance, we can tell all of the shared links that have been created over the last 30 days and across the entire estate, for instance, right? It's very easy for us to create a model out of that and then run an agent to say, every time someone creates a shared link, let's put some rules around that. And if it fits a particular category of rules, then remove that shared link, right? A good example is, let's say by default, you've got anyone links enabled within your organization. It's fairly easy to program an agent to say, anytime an anyone link gets created, remove it, right? And also let the owners know not to do that. I definitely think that's going to be the future. Where I see Orchestry going on most of these governance products is you just install it and it's just a box and it said, I have cleaned up these things, right, for you. Like you wouldn't even have to interact with that. From a permissions perspective, an agent's running in the background saying, hey, we've cleaned up 432 broken permissions in the last 24 hours. We've removed 27 guests automatically. Oh, and by the way, here's some edge cases that we don't know what to do. What do you want us to do? The model is then going to learn and automatically do that for you. I think this sense of automation is coming. I think it's a few years away, but ultimately I see that's where this is all going.
Something that you said that stood out to me. We talk so much around automation at the end user, down at the ground level, and then we talk about it at the corporate, the company-wide view in and tools. A lot of the tools, it's IT running it, it's a centralized group. But driving more of the responsibility, the ownership and data and actions to the manager, the owners of those things. I always appreciate when I'm the creator of these 5 teams, these 3 SharePoint sites, these co-pilots, when I have updates of the things that I own, when it's prompted me and says somebody's requesting this access for the site that you own, I realize, oh, that SharePoint site, I'm no longer on that project. I moved it over to this person. There needs to be a stronger, or organizations need to rely more on the people at that level, that management, that owner level of these assets to be responsible for those things.
Yeah, we totally agree. You've probably seen it in Orchestry, Christian, where every time we provision a team, we have that team information tab, which is that kind of single pane of glass. So here's all the people and the documents and the content and so forth. Ideally, where we see that experience going forward is like you said, a feed of activities that have happened. So imagine if you're an owner of a team, you can come in and say, since the last time I hit this thing, we've added 3 people, we've updated 37 documents, created 42 shared links.
Audit trail of what happened, right?
And then Ragnar has created another agent when we told him not to.
Come on.
No. Joy and Ragnar are running amok.
We're always traveling.
So I think that's one thing. And then the next thing for that, and hopefully Microsoft is working on this, is more of this consolidated dashboard for an owner. Here's all the stuff that I own. And maybe I can ask it questions a little bit easier. But ultimately, the issue is it has to provide information that's both useful and actionable, right? So if I'm a team owner, the things I probably want to know about is, has Ragnar gone in and created a bunch of agents? Or has he gone in and deleted half of the content through that? So it's those events, if we can surface those to owners and make it quick and easy to make decisions around. Like you said, Christian, if we can get those owners involved more in the kind of data steward process, that's where I think organizations are going to have much more success. Short term, long term, the vision is probably going to be, how do we create these automatic agents, AI, where it'll do it automatically for you when you can train it around these models.
It can be dashboard, it can be a report, but it can also be just a prompt. It can be a prompt, what an IT admin just runs once a week, who is currently oversharing, and then just firing up in a prompt. Michael, any plans for you to add a connector to the Copilot Studio?
We definitely will. The big issue I have at the moment with Copilot is not a functionality issue. It's more of a user experience issue. If you go on LinkedIn, people are like, here's my top Copilot prompt. It does this amazing output, like a paragraph of text. Show me all the emails that I have in a graph. To me, that user experience barrier is still too high for normal users. Prompting is a really difficult thing. I think we've kind of fooled ourselves into thinking it's like Google. It's not. There needs to be a lot of information nuance through that. The reason we haven't gone down that approach through Orchestry is that customers come to us and we could present them a prompt to Ragnar. They wouldn't even know what to put into that box. We want to give them that ability on the Copilot Studio side. How do they leverage some of the data and insights that we have within Orchestry? So again, you could have, for instance, a Copilot agent, for instance, that's running around. And then every time someone goes and deletes a whole bunch of documents and we catch that through Orchestry, maybe a flow gets fired and it does whatever else do.
So the reason why I'm also paying $22 every single month to ChatGPT Premium here is because it's so crazy helpful to just talk with ChatGPT and use the advanced voice dialogue. I use it every single day. That's the reason why I just pay for the premium version, because it is so much better than currently Copilot, which doesn't offer the voice dialogue at the moment. Yes, it will come in a few weeks, but for me, this is completely a game changer. I think that the text prompting is still going to exist in a few years, but it's more natural to talk and have a dialogue using a voice. When I'm in public transport, I'm not going to use it, but especially driving alone in the car, it's just so different.
And I think one theme here, we've talked about it quite a lot with governance, whether it's looking at the Copilot angle, provisioning, lifecycle management. And that's one thing I really like about Orchestry. I have this conversation with our clients and our partners all the time. Governance works best when we can automate it for the end users, whether that's having an agent that will one day do these actions that we've asked it and taught it to do, or whether that's making sure every time Christian provisions a team, there is a lifecycle policy that's there that says, hey, you've not used this in 90 days or 6 months or a year. Do you still need it or can we archive it? Having those things built in, keeping those things automated, because Mike, like you said, it's not easy for owners to manage what they've got. It's everywhere and we're so busy. We're always on to the next thing. So if we can automate going, hey, you own these 5 sites, teams, take a look. Do we need to purge some versions? If you're done with it, but it's not time for that policy to fire to archive it, maybe there's a button say, you know what, let's go ahead and archive this. It's done. It's over. We're keeping the environment clean for Copilot. We're staying on top of the security, the shared links, but it's not a burden that we're adding on top of other duties for those data owners.
That's always been the battle with governance, is that the more locked down a system is, the less likely end users will use that system if they can't get their work done. But so many of the policies, the constraints, the guardrails you can put up in place, end users don't know. They just know it's like, hey, I am able to go and I need to create a new team, a Microsoft Teams team for this project. And I've got 3 templates to pick from. They don't need to know everything that's happening with each of those templates to make sure that the company is compliant, that the lifecycle management is in place, and this is what happens afterwards. All they know is that they could just continue uninterrupted, get their work done, and it's doing these things.
I'm going to be a project manager. I've got a new project to manage. It's not my job to be a Microsoft 365 expert. I don't care if it's a team, a SharePoint site. I don't care if there's a list, a loop, or whatever. I know I need to be able to have real-time communication. I need places to put documents. I need these people to have access. What you got for me? Click this button to create an internal project. Workspace. Done. And all the governance is tied to it, and it's magic.
Well, I know that we're at the end of the time here, and Michael, really appreciate your time joining us today and talking about this. You know, a final pitch, anything you want to say about Orchestry to get people to come take a look?
Come check us out. We've got a really incredible solution if you're looking for governance or trying to get ready for AI. Really beautiful solution, really powerful, some great people here. So yeah, definitely reach out to us, www.orchestry.com. Thank you so much. Great conversation. We've only got 3 to 5 years before the AI overlords take over everything anyway.
That's right.
So
Well, then we'll just be living in
Always a
luxury.
pleasure.
We're not
Yeah.
going to be at work.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's going to be universal for everyone, right? So
We'll be in an eternal nap in the goo as we act never to become batteries for the world. That's right. So looking forward to that nice long nap. Well, thank you so much. And of course, to my co-host Joy and Ragnar, and we'll be back in February with another episode of Guardians of M365 Governance. So thanks a lot, everybody.
let's go. Appreciate it.
Bye.